My brother was checking his watch when the boardroom lawyer slid the envelope across the table. The meeting had barely started and Felix was already impatient, which told me everything I needed to know about how certain he was that this would go exactly as he'd planned. He'd worn his best suit, the navy canali he saved for bank presentations on Bay Street, and his wife Bryn had coordinated perfectly beside him in tailored charcoal gray, right down to the fountain pen she'd brought specifically for signing documents she clearly had no intention of reading. They looked like a matching set, competent, decisive, ready to close a deal. I sat at the opposite end of my father's boardroom table with my hands folded in my lap and said nothing. "Before we proceed to the shareholder vote," Victor said, setting the document at the center of the table, "I need to place this on record. It's a beneficial ownership declaration filed with the OSC 4 days ago and registered with the Ontario Corporate Registry as of this morning." Felix frowned. "What does that have to do with today's agenda?" Victor pushed the document toward him without answering. My brother picked it up. He read the first line, then he read it again. I watched the blood leave his face the way heat leaves a room when someone opens a window in February, a slow draining, then a sudden chill. My name was on the document, not as the minority shareholder he'd spent 4 years trying to dilute into irrelevance. Not as the quiet sister who ran spreadsheets for a mid-size accounting firm and had never caused him a moment of inconvenience. As the registered beneficial owner of 53% of Maple Ridge Properties Limited, the company he had already mentally sold. I'm 34 years old, and I want to tell you how we got there. Because it did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident, and it started, as these things often do, at a family gathering where someone said something they can never take back. My father died in late September, 6 weeks before that boardroom meeting. Liver cancer, he'd known for nearly a year, he told Felix in the spring. He told me the week before he went into palliative care, sitting in his hospital room with an untouched Tim Hortons coffee on the tray table between us, and I have spent every day since then turning over the question of what that sequence of events was meant to tell me. The wake was held at my aunt's house in Burlington, a generous Victorian on a tree-lined street that smelled of cedar and old upholstery, and the particular kind of grief that settles over a family when the one person who held them together is gone. I arrived early. I helped set out the food. I made sure the coffee was fresh. These are the things I do when I don't know what else to do, and I had not yet figured out what else to do. Felix and Bryn arrived an hour after I did, looking as though they'd come from a business lunch rather than a wake. Felix wore a suit I didn't recognize, slim-cut, expensive, the kind of thing you buy when you're anticipating being photographed. Bryn kissed me on both cheeks and said I looked tired, which was her way of saying I looked like I hadn't made an effort. I hadn't made an effort. I had been sitting beside my father while he died. They worked the room. Felix accepted condolences with the polished ease of someone who had been quietly preparing for this day for quite some time. He mentioned the company 3 times in the first 40 minutes, the direction he was taking things, the conversations he'd already had, the interested parties who had reached out. Interested parties. I pulled him aside near the kitchen about an hour in. The house was warm with too many people and the smell of catered salmon, and Felix looked faintly annoyed at being interrupted from his circuit. "What interested parties?" I asked. "Dad's been gone 4 days." "We've been approached," he said. "It's preliminary. I'm a director of Maple Ridge. I should be part of any conversation about Hazel." He said my name the way he'd said it since we were teenagers, with a faint, patient exhalation that meant he considered whatever I was about to say already handled. "You run spreadsheets for an accounting firm. I've been on the ground at Maple Ridge for 7 years. The real decisions, the ones that actually matter, those have been mine. You know that." I looked at my brother in his Bay Street suit, eating smoked salmon at our father's wake, and I said nothing. He walked away to accept another handshake. Bryn materialized at my elbow a few minutes later, holding a glass of sparkling water and watching Felix across the room with the proprietary satisfaction of someone surveying property they've already decided to redecorate. "You must be relieved," she said, not unkindly, almost bored. "The company stuff, I mean. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Felix will handle everything." I turned to look at her. "You can figure out what's next," she continued. "Maybe something part-time while things settle. That accounting job must be very steady." She smiled, very practical. I thanked her for coming and walked to the other end of the room. 2 weeks after the wake, I received a letter from a lawyer I'd never heard of, retained by my brother in his capacity as majority shareholder of Maple Ridge Properties. The letter informed me that Felix had invoked a clause in the shareholder agreement, a clause I had never been shown, drafted at Felix's request 4 years prior and inserted into the original agreement by a lawyer my brother had brought in without telling our father, to remove me as a director, effective immediately, pending a formal board resolution. The resolution would be voted on at a meeting I was not entitled to attend. I sat at my kitchen table in my Hamilton condo and read the letter twice. I looked out the window at the bay. I thought about my father saying keep it that way for now 2 years ago over coffee at the Grimsby Tim Hortons, and I understood what he'd meant. Then I called Adele. Adele Carmichael had been my wealth manager for 6 years. Before that, she'd been the first person in a professional context who had looked at the way I handled money and said, with genuine curiosity, "Where did you learn to think about this?" The honest answer was that I'd spent my 20s reading every corporate filing I could find, analyzing the way family-owned companies fractured and reformed under pressure, watching the patterns of how value moved when no one thought anyone else was paying attention. I had not, for the record, been running spreadsheets at a mid-size accounting firm. That was the story I gave people because it was easier than explaining the truth. Ironwood Capital was a privately held investment firm I'd incorporated in Ontario 4 years prior. We specialized in acquiring undervalued minority stakes in family-owned businesses, companies where the internal disputes were loud enough that the fundamentals went unexamined, and either stabilizing their governance or managing a proper arm's-length sale. We had 11 employees. We'd completed 9 acquisitions in 3 years. We were not large, we were not loud, we paid attention. The first acquisition had nearly broken me. It was a small manufacturing company in Brantford, a family print shop that had been quietly mismanaged for a decade, while the 2 brothers who owned it fought about everything except the balance sheet. I'd bought a minority stake with the last of my savings, spent 8 months in their operations learning how they worked, and written a restructuring plan that neither brother had asked for. When I presented it at their kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, the older brother had laughed. I had left the meeting and sat in my car in their parking lot for 20 minutes, deciding whether to sell my stake back and walk away. I didn't walk away. I found a third brother, an estranged one in Winnipeg, who held a dormant share certificate their father had given him 30 years earlier and forgotten to record properly, and I helped him validate his stake through the Ontario Corporate Registry. Suddenly, the 2 brothers had a casting vote they hadn't anticipated. They listened to the restructuring plan. The company turned around in 14 months. I sold my stake at a return that paid for Ironwood's first proper office since 3 years of Adele's fees. My father had known about all of it. He'd sat across from me at that Tim Hortons 2 years into Ironwood and listened to the whole story without interrupting. He set down his coffee and looked out the window for a long time. "Does Felix know?" he'd asked. "No. Keep it that way for now." I'd kept everything private, the firm, the acquisitions, and especially the shares. Because for 4 years, every time Felix had issued new shares of Maple Ridge to dilute the equity and raise capital for his development projects, I had purchased shares through 111-86547 Ontario Inc., a numbered holding company with no visible connection to my name. Each purchase was at fair market value. Each transfer was registered correctly. Each one triggered the right of first refusal notice that the shareholder agreement required, sent by registered mail to the Oakville office address Felix had used for all corporate correspondence since he took over operations. 7 notices, 7 30-day windows, 7 expirations without response. Felix had been diluting me for 4 years. I had been buying back twice what he took. When I called Adele from my kitchen table after reading the Director Removal letter, I was calm in the way that happens when you've been quietly waiting for something to arrive. "I need to move on Maple Ridge," I told her. "Full acquisition, file the beneficial ownership update with the OSC before the end of the week." There was a pause. "You want to go to 53? I want to own the conversation before he closes the door. "Hazel, once you file, there's no quiet about it." "I know," I said, "that's the point." The boardroom at Maple Ridge's Oakville office still had the same Mr. Coffee machine on the credenza that had been there since I was 15 years old. visiting Dad after school and doing homework at the corner of this same table while he took calls. Felix had changed nothing in 7 years of running the company. I'd always thought that said something about him, that he wanted to inhabit our father's world without the discomfort of building his own. Victor was already seated when I arrived. He organized his materials without hurrying. Hammond Ricci, Felix's corporate lawyer, arrived with an air of theatrical impatience and set his leather briefcase on the table with the particular confidence of someone who has never walked into a room and been surprised by it. Felix did not look at me when he sat down. Bryn uncapped her fountain pen. Hammond laid out the agenda: director removal resolution, shareholder vote on the sale to Lakefront REIT, transfer of signing authority, clean, efficient, final. Before we proceed, Victor said. The room shifted slightly. Hammond stopped mid-sentence. Victor placed the OSC filing on the table and slid it to the center. I need to table a change in the beneficial ownership register, filed 4 days ago and recorded with the Ontario Corporate Registry as of this morning. Hammond reached for it first. He read the first page. His face stayed professionally neutral for approximately 3 seconds. Then something went out of his eyes, and what replaced it was the specific blankness of a man recalculating in real time. Where did this share block come from, he asked, and the theatrical confidence was gone. Victor explained 111-86547 Ontario Inc. He explained the 4 years of registered share purchases. He explained the right of first refusal notices, and the 7 registered mail confirmations and the 30-day windows that had each elapsed without a response from the Oakville office. Felix picked up the document. He read it standing up, both hands flat on the table, leaning over it like he was trying to hold it down. This can't be right, he said. His voice was completely flat, not the voice he used when he was angry, the voice he used when the ground had moved and he didn't have a footing yet. The filings are current and correct, Victor said. As of this morning, my client holds 53% of the issued and outstanding common shares of Maple Ridge Properties. The proposed resolution to sell to Lakefront REIT requires majority approval. My client does not approve of the sale. The resolution fails. Bryn set down her fountain pen. The Mr. Coffee machine gurgled cheerfully in the corner. Hammond tried the right of first refusal argument. Victor produced the Canada Post tracking confirmations, signed by the Oakville office receptionist, time-stamped, 7 of them in a stack. Hammond looked at Felix. Felix looked at the table. I also need to raise a disclosure matter, Victor said, and produced a second folder. The Lakefront REIT deal values Maple Ridge at $63 million. An independent appraisal commissioned by Ironwood Capital 8 weeks ago values the company at $78 million. Accounting for 2 active development approvals in the Niagara region that have not been disclosed to the prospective buyer. He set it on the table. The OSC takes a particular interest in undisclosed material facts during the negotiation of corporate transactions. I've referred the matter to a colleague who handles securities compliance. That process is separate from today's meeting. Hammond closed his briefcase. I looked at my brother across the length of our father's table. He was looking at me the way people look at something when they realize it was never what they assumed it was. The numbered company notices went to your office address, I said. My voice was steady. 7 of them, over 4 years. It's possible your receptionist filed them as junk mail and you never saw them. I genuinely don't know what happened on your end. I paused. But you did receive them, 7 times, in 7 years. And you never followed up. You planned this, Felix said, not an accusation, almost a question. I bought shares in our father's company through a properly registered holding company at fair market value with correct documentation, the same way any shareholder would. I held his gaze. You inserted a clause into the shareholder agreement to remove me as director without telling me it existed. Dad's original lawyer mentioned it to me 2 months before Dad died. I would have preferred to hear it from you. Bryn picked up her uncapped fountain pen, put it back down, picked up her legal pad, set it on top of the pen. The meeting is adjourned, Victor said simply. My client will be in touch regarding next steps for the governance structure. Felix found me in the parking lot. The October wind off Lake Ontario was sharp and the escarpment glowed gold in the distance, the way it does in the last weeks before the cold settles in for good. He walked toward me with his hands in his pockets and his navy suit jacket open, and he looked older than he had inside. How long? He asked. 4 years. He looked out across the parking lot. Dad knew? Yes. Something moved across his face, grief and something underneath it, the specific pain of realizing you miscounted the people on your side. I wasn't trying to push you out, he said. The REIT deal, I thought the timing was right. After Dad, I thought you'd want the simplest possible outcome. He stopped. You never seemed to want to be involved. I wasn't involved in the way you could see, I said. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. You told me I ran spreadsheets. I waited. I let Bryn say that thing about the accounting job, he said. At the wake, he didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. I'm sorry for that. I believed him. I believed it was the truest thing he'd said to me in years. That didn't make it sufficient, but it was something. What happens to the company, he asked. We go back to Lakefront REIT with accurate numbers, 78 million, properly disclosed, properly represented. If they want to proceed at fair value, we discuss it. Both of us, at the table. I looked at him. Or we don't sell. The Grimsby townhouse project has 18 months of runway by itself. Dad built it to last, it's still building. Felix put his hands in his pockets. He was looking at the building behind us, the mid-rise his company had developed in 2019, still his best project, the one he was genuinely proud of and talked about every time we had a conversation that lasted more than 10 minutes. I didn't know about Ironwood, he said. I know you didn't. How do you run a capital firm and an accounting job at the same time? There was no accounting job, I said. There hasn't been for 4 years. He absorbed that. I could see him recalibrating something, not just the facts of the situation but the whole story he'd been telling himself about me, about who I was and what I was capable of and why I'd never seemed to need him the way he'd always assumed I must. Dad knew, he said again, not a question this time. Dad knew. He nodded once, slowly, and walked back toward the building. I got into my gray Subaru, the practical one, the sensible one, the car Bryn had dismissed at Christmas dinner 2 years ago as evidence of my limited ambitions, and drove back to Hamilton with the radio off. 3 months later, Maple Ridge Properties renegotiated with Lakefront REIT. The revised valuation reflected the accurate appraisal. 74 million, after a second round of due diligence that accounted for the development approvals and the land bank. Felix and I signed together. The estate employees received retention bonuses before the transition closed. The Grimsby site manager, who had worked for my father for 19 years, sent me a card that I keep in my desk drawer. The OSC review found inadequate disclosure processes, but no evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. Felix retained a compliance advisor. His file was closed. I had not wanted criminal trouble for my brother. I had wanted him to understand what he'd been doing. I am still not certain whether he does. We have lunch twice a year now at a diner near the old Grimsby plant. We talk about his new role consulting for a mid-sized developer in Mississauga. We talk about Ironwood, which has 12 employees now and just closed its 10th acquisition. We don't talk about the boardroom, or the wake, or the registered mail that sat unopened for 4 years. Some conversations are held in the space between what's said and what isn't. My father left me a letter. His palliative care nurse handed it to me the day after he died, in a sealed envelope with my name written in the handwriting he'd had since before I was born. Neat, deliberate, slightly right-leaning. Most of it is private, but the last paragraph has stayed with me. You've always understood that real security isn't given to you, he wrote. It's built when no one's watching. I should have told you sooner, out loud in front of the people who needed to hear it, that I was proud of you for building yours. I keep the letter in my desk drawer at the Ironwood Capital office. Not an accounting firm, not a spreadsheet job, but a proper space on the north end of Hamilton in a converted textile building with original brick walls and windows that face the bay. 12 people work there. We are not large and we are not loud and we pay attention. My brother told me I ran spreadsheets at a mid-size accounting firm. He said it at our father's wake like it was a settled fact, like there was nothing behind it worth examining. Some assumptions cost more than people realize. Some lessons only land once. If you've ever had to build something in silence because the people around you decided who you were before you had the chance to show them, drop a comment. I'd like to know I'm not the only one.